Okay, so why don't we do it this way? Do you want to do 15 minutes of back and forth and then 15 minutes of audience Q&A with the last half hour?
Okay.
Yeah?
Fine.
Okay. All right, so
Okay,
why don't we start with you, Esha?
Okay. So basically, repeat. I said repeat. I'm sorry, I got the dates wrong with the Dennis v. U.S. versus Brandenburg. But what the Supreme Court has repeatedly done, this is since 1970s, of course, is that it has used the First Amendment for deregulation. For example, in Public Citizen v. Virginia Pharmacy, it invoked the First Amendment to allow advertisement by pharmaceuticals. But we do not see the same kind of way the First Amendment has been invoked to protect citizens. For example, Ramsey Orta, the man who took the video, he's still in prison, maybe not for the for whatever reason. There, and then there's of course the Citizens United, which and there's another, I can't remember this exact decision, but there was a decision where the Supreme Court said it was okay. They said it was okay to use the Boy Scouts for Boy Scouts could ban gay people because of freedom of assembly. So the point is, none of these rights exist in abstract. They're always wielded against a class of people by a class of people. And so Chomsky never acknowledges that. Oh, maybe he does mildly, but he still falls into the liberal trap of not getting context, not understanding who's in power. And I know he wrote a book called Understanding Power, but often it kind of doesn't actually understand power. So, for example, he says that he idealizes spontaneous movements, but the problem is that we have the FBI, the CIA, and the U.S. military to actually fight against spontaneous revolutionary movements. So, what chance does the powerless have when you have the FBI, CIA, whatever, to constantly undermine spontaneous revolutionary movements? But for him, he's never thought about that. And nuance, he often, for example, he thinks like he's just often been wrong. For example, he said that.
So I wonder if maybe before we get into those other responses, if it would be good to talk a little bit more about the free speech issue, because I think one thing that is important to recognize why Chomsky, who by the way I think has a very good understanding of the operations of power and the way, for example, in which the U.S. media, one of the subjects he's written most about, operates to freeze out points of view that contradict dominant narratives. But I think that, like, for example, you can recognize that it's true that in a broad brush sense, one class is exercising power over another class. Of course, that's true. And of course, Chomsky would agree that that's true. But also that the institutional means by which they do so and the strategies they use to legitimize that rule do make a real difference for people resisting them. And the Brandenburg case is actually a great example of that, because it's not just a matter of sort of ad hoc, okay, they'll pretend that we have these free speech rules, when there's a group that serves the interests of capital, they won't otherwise. What you actually, I think, if that decision hadn't gone that way, not, of course, there wasn't plenty of repression of the New Left, but there was a lot of new left and anti-war activity post 1969 that couldn't have happened without much faster and much more efficient repression without those standards. Now, I wish that line about the people's stick was a cliche. Unfortunately, I think that most people, including most people on the left, have never heard it. But I think it's important to recognize, you talked about who's holding the stick. And well, if we hold the stick, then, we're going to beat up Amazon and all these companies. And I think that the point that Chomsky would rightly call attention to is who's we, right? Does we mean some sort of democratic institution representing working people, which of course is only actually possible if you have free exchange of views among the workers, so people could participate and decide and collectively make up their minds within that? Or does we mean some party state bureaucracy claiming to act on behalf of the people, which is where I think that people stick line is much more appropriate. And I would just wrap up the point by calling attention to one particularly telling example, which is if you're going to talk about the relationship between the people stick and corporations, well, look at one of the largest sticks in the world today that was built up calling itself the People's Stick, the one in the People's Republic of China, which not only does not exercise today that stick against corporations, but once the stick was built up and once it got to be so big that it was impossible to do things like organize a real independent trade union, then what often happens, which is that the operators of that stick decided that they would be better off going from exercising their privileges in this indirect way through this party state bureaucracy to exercise them in a more direct way by making a transition to capitalism while keeping the people's stick. And today, the people's stick is the enforcer of the corporate power of companies like Foxconn that exploit working people with the kind of efficient brutality, in squeezing out every drop of profit possible, with the people's stick always lurking in the background, that they literally have to build suicides to stop workers from killing and decided to kill themselves in the middle of the shift. And I'd say, looking at that progression over time, Chomsky is somebody who, again, he's very nuanced about this. He's all about recognizing the real accomplishments and virtues, for example, of the Cuban Revolution. He's gone on and on about that. But I think in recognizing the danger of building up that kind of people's stick unrestricted by democratic checks and a right to disagree, I think that he's shown himself to be far more perceptive, far more insightful.
Ben, I think we should pass it off just a little bit. You've had a long time to speak.
Okay.
Well, I'm looking at Chinese, China actually cracked down on Foxconn. They said that Foxconn and Apple were violating Chinese labor laws, and basically they had monitors there to basically change it. And so the corporation they also lost about 30 to 15%. So yeah, China. It's easy to make a straw man about China, but I know they did.
Plenty of cases of the U.S. cracking down on labor law violators, and labor laws.
Well, when did the U.S. do it?
When has the U.S. enforced labor law? Like ever? Okay, all right. I think that you're not going to have any trouble. Go on Google, find.
No, you find an example.
I'm sorry, but if you're going to make an incredible claim, an obviously false and absurd claim, like the United States has never enforced labor law, of course they have. Now, in fact, if you compare labor law in the United States, or even a United States client with a history of being horribly repressive, like Taiwan, to China. Like Taiwan, where Foxconn is actually from, in many ways the labor laws are better than China. Minimum wage is higher.
No, actually, but the cost of living is different, and that's just really okay. So let me.
Do you think adjusted for cost of living, the minimum wage is higher in China?
I don't know. But what I do know is that yesterday, for example, the state of Ohio had a hotline for reporting employers to report their employees if they were to go off like if they ask for having coronavirus. Yeah, and so yeah, actually, so basically you can actually come up with the time when the U.S. has actually in the So I don't know why you can't come up with an easy example of when the U.S. has cracked down on labor law violations.
Oh, for God's sake, that's such
No,
a
I want you to come up
cheap
with one.
and dishonest response to something obvious, like
With one example.
clearly the procedure for doing this is spending 15 minutes. Okay. So to be clear, is your contention that there has never been a case where the United States has enforced?
My contention is that you can't find an example right now because you're not really. My contention is you just can't seem to find an example to prove your argument.
Yeah, is that the fact that I don't have
so
labor law cases off of the top of my head.
Google exists.
Something about yes, I'm actually listening to what you're saying and not stopping and doing 5 minutes of research in the middle of a debate. If you're going to pretend like that establishes anything about anything, that's unbelievably bad faith.
No, it's not. You seem to want a bad faith.
All right, can we ground this back to the topic at hand, maybe? Because I think we're going way off. We're veering far away from it.
Well, no, because bad faith, he often uses it as a tactic, which means basically not.
Of when else I've used as a tactic. If I often use it, do what you asked me to. Tell me when else I've used it.
You've used it for just about in this whole Twitter exchange where you claim
everyone, everybody.
Operator.
Okay. Again, we're veering into the personal. We're going way off the topic. We should be concentrating on should the left outgrow Chomsky, right? That's the topic that you both agreed that you're going to talk about. So
ask Ben so let me ask Ben a question. Okay, so you said that workers need free speech in order to have a democracy. So what effect does this little work if the worker uses their free speech to say Heil Hitler? Does it enhance, how does a worker having the right to say Heil Hitler enhance democracy?
If you want to look at the relationship between cracking down on people saying Heil Hitler and cracking down on the kind of exchange of views that actually do matter for the sake of a functional democracy, then I think one really relevant real-world case to look at is the attempts in Lance's home country, Canada, to use the hate speech laws to crack down against the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement about Palestine. The point is, as with the people's stick,
Canada does not have the people's stick because it's a bourgeoisie democracy.
Yes, I'm not claiming that Canada has the people's stick. I'm claiming that the point about the people's stick also applies in this case, which is that when you empower people to decide which views can be expressed and which can't be expressed without crackdown, simply hoping that it's only going to be used in the case that it should be used without any sort of institutional safeguards against that is hopelessly naive.
So you still did not answer the question. How do the workers benefit?
I'm pretty sure I did.
Let's say that I'm in a group with workers and one person keeps saying Heil Hitler. How is that how are the people's will being advanced? Because that is what democracy is. How is the collective will of the people there being advanced by that one worker saying Heil Hitler?
By him saying it? Not at all. But of course, that's absurd down to what it said. The actual question is...
No, it's not.
The obvious distortion of what I said. The actual question on the
All right, when both of you talk over each other, no one can hear either of you, so it all just kind of becomes white noise. All right.
So I actually just used the word Heil Hitler. I did not say anything else about it. My exact thing was, so you agreed that there may be times when free speech does not always advance democracy, is what I was trying to say, because you agreed that. Okay, so you think it's okay.
If you're interested in what I said, I can say it, but you seem to be more interested in finding ways to caricature it. What I said was that that I think institutional safeguards of free speech are crucial to the meaningful possibility of democratic deliberation and decision making by a group of workers. That's a very different thing from saying that any particular use of that free speech advances that. Obviously, lots of uses of free speech aren't going to advance that. The question about whether free speech is necessary for democracy isn't about whether any given use of free speech is good for democracy.
Okay.
It's about whether democracy is better safeguarded by having those institutional protections or not. That's the serious question.
So what I'm going to do for the last 15 minutes is...
Wait, 1 second. Let me answer this. The problem is that you do not have a values neutral approach, as in the same like democracy quote free speech, like Citizens United. What they use free speech as an excuse for Citizens United. How exactly does that advance democracy? So I'm saying in order to properly analyze free speech itself, you need to figure out against who, like you need to have a class analysis on how the different classes can use free speech to advance democracy or not. Like, for example, Citizens United, is that, do you think money is speech? Clearly not. But that's, so what I'm saying is that you can't just have an abstract free speech box, but you have to investigate it more deeply to figure out how is this alleged democracy using free speech, and who is getting the free speech rights, and is it evenly distributed? And that kind of analysis is what Chomsky keeps on missing.
Okay, can we move on to the
distinct one-sentence response? You can think that the interests of the working class are best advanced by a broad value-neutral interpretation of free speech without thinking Citizens United was correctly decided. There's no contradiction there.
Okay, we're going to move on.
So here's the truth about the system.